I'm Jolie Braun, curator of modern literature and manuscripts in the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library at The Ohio State Universities, which collects, preserves, and provides access to literary and historical materials from medieval manuscripts to contemporary novels and zines. Today's event will feature Rebecca Rego Barry discussing her book about the early 20th century mystery writer Carolyn Wells. Part biography and part sleuthing narrative, Barry's work documents both Wells' life and career, as well as her own experience researching this once famous author. Barry will also share discoveries drawn from the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library's Carolyn Wells Papers, which contains literary manuscripts, photographs, and juvenilia. We're especially excited to be hosting Rebecca's talk this week, as her book just came out on Tuesday. And in a recent review, the Saturday Evening Post called it, quote, an engrossing journey into Wells' life and work and a thoughtful examination of why and how best-selling writers like Wells can vanish from our memories. So before we get started, just a brief note about the structure of this event and some housekeeping. So Rebecca's presentation will run about 40 minutes, and then the remainder of the hour will be time for Q&A. A few webinar tips include the audio and video will be muted for all attendees. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box. I will be monitoring that, so you can do that at any point during our session. The chat will be used for comments and general discussion. Closed captioning can be enabled by clicking the CC button. And lastly, today's session is being recorded, so you can watch it at a later date if you'd like to. I'd like to now introduce our speaker. Rebecca Rego Barry is the author of The Vanishing of Carolyn Wells, Investigations into a Forgotten Mystery Author. For almost 2 decades, her articles about books, history, and the culture of collecting appeared in The Guardian, Financial Times, Smithsonian, Slate, LitHub, Crime Reads, and elsewhere. Her first book, Rare Books Uncovered, True Stories of Fantastic Finds in Unlikely Places, developed from her longtime editorship of Fine Books and Collections magazine. She's currently the director of communications at the Robb Collection, a firm that buys and sells historical autographs and documents. Okay, well, without further ado, Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And Jolie, thank you so much for planning this and setting it up. So the first thing I'm going to do here is share my screen so we can get a view of Carolyn Wells. There we go. Does everyone see that? So I'm really excited to talk to you today about Carolyn Wells. Carolyn Wells wrote 180 books in her lifetime. Primarily, they were published right around the turn of the 20th century and then the first few decades of the 20th century. Some became bestsellers, others were made into films. She was so popular in her time that there was even a Milton Bradley card game licensed under her name. But she faded into obscurity after her death in 1942. How and why that happened is something I've tried to discover over the past 3 or 4 years as I researched and wrote this book. Today, I'm going to present an overview of her literary life. Plus, I'm going to sprinkle in some details culled from the Ohio State University Library's own special collections, as Jolie mentioned, because it was immensely helpful to my research. Your library has by far the largest chunk of what would have been Carolyn's authorial archive, which was broken up after her death. How this material turned up in Ohio is one of the many mysteries I unraveled along the way. But first, who was she? So Carolyn Wells was first a librarian, then a poet, a humorist, a magazine editor, a writer of children's and young adult literature, a silent film writer, a Broadway playwright and librettist, a puzzle master, an anthologist, the first editor of the Best American Mystery Stories series, and a mystery novelist. She was acquainted with 4 presidents, and many of the authors and artists of the early 20th century, including Mark Twain, Rudyard Kipling, Frances Hutchinson Burnett, and on and on. She was also a book collector, whose renowned collection of Walt Whitman now resides at the Library of Congress. And the book collecting, is where we're going to start, with her book plates. There they are. I'm going to start here because that's where it all started for me. I was at the New York Antiquarian Book Fair in 2011 And my husband came with me that year, tagged along with me. We go every year. It's a wonderful fair if you haven't been. And when I was off chatting with some bookseller friends, he was off at a different booth buying me, as a surprise birthday gift, a first edition of Henry David Thoreau's Walden, which has always been a real favorite of mine. And when I opened it a few weeks later, it's an old book, so it has some history to it, has some provenance, and had a couple of book plates in it, one of which is pictured here on the right. It really grabbed my attention. It's got this, Renaissance woman. She's kind of holding in her hands this little gargoyle-like creature, which I would later come to know as the Lincoln Imp. She's got her motto there in the circle behind her. It says, "I wonder why," and then her name along the bottom, Carolyn Wells. It was not a name I was familiar with, but female book collectors of the 20th century are scarce enough that the name stuck in my head. So when I started to notice her name at book fairs again and again, and I started to notice them on the covers of 1920s and 1930s era fiction, mysteries, took me a long time, but finally I put two and two together and began to, realize that this book collector was one and the same with the author. I just wanted to show you too here on if you're seeing this alternate variant book plate of hers, which doesn't have her in it anymore, or the face I'd come to know as Carolyn's face, but retains that little gargoyle creature and her motto. And again, this is where it started for me, so this is where I want to start. So after I figured out, I heard that this British publisher was going to publish a new edition of a book called Murder in the Bookshop, which was probably her most famous novel. And that is really sort of the aha moment for me. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write an article about how this woman who was a rare book collector wrote a mystery about rare book collecting. And so I did that in March of 2020, actually. The article came out with this magazine called Crime Reads. And for that article, I actually interviewed Professor Margaret D. Stetz at the University of Delaware, who at the time was finalizing a scholarly article about Carolyn's work as a humor writer. And that was yet another layer to Carolyn's life that I didn't know anything about. And I was really coming to understand that Carolyn was more than mysteries and more than rare books. Now I had this whole humor avenue to look at. And so I kind of started Googling around and finding little and often finding facts that differed from one another. Sadly, there's no central archive and there was no estate. So I just kind of started making a list of all of Carolyn's published books because even the bibliographies online were incomplete. And I ordered a used copy of her autobiography and kind of just started with those two things. And, like I said before, this was March 2020. So this kind of carried me through the first 6 months probably of the pandemic. So one of the first things I learned about her is that she was born in Rahway, New Jersey, central New Jersey suburb, in 1862. The Wells family was middle class, if not upper middle class. Carolyn's youth consisted of social clubs, church events, amateur theatricals, summer vacations at the beach. They had a lovely home, as you can see here, which I got to go and at least look at on the outside in 2022. It was a prosperous, privileged life, but not without hardships, including the death of two siblings, one from scarlet fever. And during that same bout of illness, Carolyn lost hearing in one ear, a condition that troubled her for the rest of her life. Now, some of my preliminary research at this point offered hope that a few institutional and academic libraries might have some archival holdings related to Carolyn. For the most part, it was a small box here, a couple of letters there, and it's really a hunch that actually lasted for years. When I heard from Jolie Braun, she told me that Ohio State University libraries had something called the Carolyn Wells Papers, and I was immediately interested. So that was the spring of 2021, and I knew I wouldn't be visiting anytime soon, but Jolie was kind enough to send me images to work from. And one of the first things that she sent to me was a picture of this miniature booklet. Here we go. It's titled 1 Year at Our Boarding School. It's a little hand-stitched booklet made around 1868. and it contains a preface which states, if you can't read it there, the author of this book would say that if it meets with such approval as did that little magazine, The Children's Weekly, she will be perfectly satisfied. It immediately reminded me of the Bronte family juvenilia, those little books and magazines that Charlotte and her siblings had produced earlier, decades earlier, for their own amusement. I also noticed the name written here, Carrie B. Wells. And I later confirmed with her family that this was Carolyn's given name, and she later changed it. So this booklet is fantastic evidence of how precocious she was, and perhaps destined to be an author. She graduated as her class valedictorian, but refused the opportunity to go to college, instead setting a course of study for herself that included German, French, history, botany, and 3 summers worth of Shakespeare in Amherst, Massachusetts. Okay, here's some photos of Carolyn from the 1890s, which I just think are just amazing, beautiful photos. So in the 1890s, she's nearing 30, and she doesn't have a lot of prospects. There's not many jobs that are considered acceptable for women in her position at the time. She had not yet married, and I don't know if she felt pressure to do something, but she took a part-time job at the Rahway Public Library in 1890. She had a wonderful mentor there, and the job gave her the opportunity to travel to other libraries, and most importantly, to read a lot. She says that's all she did. She ordered books and she read them, which most librarians today would not be happy if you suggested that that's what they did with their time, but that's what she did. And perhaps most importantly, during her time working in the library, she discovered the world of little magazines, these little artsy, progressive journals that sprung up in the shadow of big mainstream magazines. Here are a couple of examples. So, well, here on the left, you have Puck. That was one of her favorites. And her first clips in journalism appeared in Puck, in Vogue, actually. They were poems and short prose, light and witty, what she called nonsense poetry, like in the fashion of Lewis Carroll or Edward Lear. Fashion was a favorite topic of hers. Here also we have The Lark, which was another magazine, an unusual literary magazine from San Francisco. She pitched the editor there, Gillette Burgess, who responded by telling her, quote, "No women contributors." But she took that as a challenge and kept writing to him, and they developed a friendship which actually lasted for decades, and not only a friendship, but they collaborated on many projects over the next like 3 or 4 decades. So she really won him over. Another magazine that she worked on, in fact, became one of the editors of, was called the Daily Tatler. It's said to be the first literary daily in America. It consisted of 8 pages of snarky literary commentary, which is very on brand for her. She was the lone woman on the masthead, and frankly, only there because she had written to the publisher and asked for the job a few months prior. She wrote that she had heard he was looking for an editor, and that, quote, "A bright woman is better than a dull man and much cheaper," which is just a zinger I could not leave out of this talk. The Daily Tatler only lasted 13 days, but it made a dent anyway. And that was in 1896, which would end up being a big year for Carolyn. Because that's the year she's not only published in the Chapbook, which is another pretty famous artsy little magazine, but her first book comes out. It's called At the Sign of the Sphinx, with that beautiful decorative cover there in the middle. It's actually a book of riddles, really. They called them charades, but it's not charades in the modern sense. It's really kind of like word play and riddles. And when this book comes out, or after this book comes out, Carolyn's writing career really takes off. She keeps her day job, but she becomes a common presence on the pages of bigger magazines like Life, Harper's, and the Saturday Evening Post. In fact, her constant presence on those pages made people come up with this question: have women a sense of humor? Which is actually a question we still hear in the 21st century. It is something that they it was a questionable thing at the time. And Carolyn would be listed in magazines alongside, it would be like the 10 funniest people in America. And there would be one woman on the list, and it would be Carolyn. Um, they would hold her up as proof that women could, in fact, be funny. And here are two examples of what she really did best. You can see here on well, to my left, I hope it's your left too, a limerick called The Tutor, which was published in Life magazine in 1898. A tutor who tooted the flute tried to teach two young tutors to toot, said the two to the tutor, is it harder to toot or to tutor two tutors to toot? It's pretty hard to do. And then she published somewhat pricklier verse, particularly on bookish topics. And here's an excerpt from her A Primer of Literature, which ends with this. What makes a book a phenomenal success? Much bad, much pad, and much ad, which I love. In fact, I could fill an entire book with just her bookish poems and prose and parody. She really disliked Henry James and she was actually kind of vicious about it in a really funny way. She loved poking fun at the publishing world, which she was really coming to know very well. There were times in the late 1890s, turn of the century, when she was working on 6, 7, 8 different books in a given year, and with as many publishers. So she really must have just been networking constantly. She was also at the time writing for children. And I say writing for children, but it's really the same forms as in which she was writing for adults. Poems, short pieces of prose, puzzles were another huge part of what she did. And this is one of her more unusual puzzles, the bicycle puzzle. So she did a lot of writing for this magazine seen here, St. Nicholas, which is a literary magazine. It was published by Scribner, but it was for children. So it was edited by Mary Mapes Dodge, with whom she would become friends. And let's see. I think I have another example here next. Yeah, I have another example here of something from the Ohio State University Library's collection. And it really is another great example of her early attempts to get published in this children's arena. It's called a booklet called The Rahway Rhymes. The Rahway Rhymes, New Education Writing Booklets. This is a manuscript booklet that she made, and I think what it is, it's sort of like a mock-up, something she was maybe shopping around to different publishers to see if she could get it published. And it's an ABC book, what they called an ABC book. And I don't know if you can read there in the bottom right, she has this little color illustration of a postcard, and it's addressed to Aunt Carolyn, Rahway, New Jersey, and it says, "Dear Aunt Carolyn, I am going to begin to go to school next week. I am 6, Lucy." It's just really amazing, and I kind of wonder if she did this art herself. That's something I don't know, but I know it's a book that she's mocking up to try to sell. I also know that right around this time, let's say 1900, 1901, she in fact did become an aunt. So she did not have a niece named Lucy who was 6, but she did become an aunt. There was really a growing market and a need for what she could create. This was quality writing for children and young adults. And so she parlays her magazine work, the work in St. Nicholas and also in a magazine called Youth's Companion, into a series of young adult novels. Her first actually appears on the pages of St. Nicholas in 1898. It's called The Story of Betty, and that was published in book form in 1899. But the most famous were the Patty books. These were published, there were 17 Patty books published between 1901 and 1919. And they're reprinted well into the 40s, maybe beyond. They were hugely popular. I still have people who write to me now to tell me how much Patty meant to them as children, or how their grandmothers gave them copies, mothers gave them copies. And that I really saw that actually in my research as well, because when I would look at digital copies online in university libraries, and you can see every single page when you look at like these digital editions, you could see these wonderful inscriptions from grandmother to granddaughter, aunt to niece. They were just books that that people really were into giving as gifts, and children collected them in a series. They were considered very acceptable, very wholesome reading at a time when that space was almost completely taken up by Louisa May Alcott. In 1902, Carolyn actually quits her library job at the age of 40 to pursue this second career as an author. And that's one of the things I actually really admire about her, is that at 40, which is practically ancient by the standards of her time, she makes the leap into becoming an author, a full-time author, I should say. She's already been writing for years. And she is at this time writing children's, young adult, poetry, humor, novels, all of it concurrently. She's just incredibly productive and incredibly prolific. And this, what you're seeing here, is really just a sampling of some of the books that came out during this, right around the turn of the century. You've got some poetry books, you've got an illustrated novel, you've got books that are fairy stories for like young adults, but I'm sure adults would enjoy them as well. You have her nonsense anthology, which is actually one of 5 anthologies that she published with Scribner. There was also satire, parody, whimsy. And the New York Times actually said, anthologies before Carolyn Wells took to making them were grave and formidable things. So, and then also, not her nonsense anthology changed all that, which I think is a great quote. But a major part of her Act 2 was writing detective novels. And it's what she becomes best known for in her time. Carolyn loved Arthur Conan Doyle. I mean, he was so popular in the 1890s. She also loved Poe, and she also loved Anna Katharine Green, who's considered the mother of American detective fiction. So those are the inspirations. She sees her first detective story into print in 1905, and more begin to appear in newspapers, magazines, and then books. She excelled at the country house, locked room variety of mystery story, a decade before Agatha Christie would do the same, and develops Fleming Stone as a scholarly detective who swoops in at the 11th hour to solve the crime. Her first book, her first novel, at least in book form, she published some of the stories as short stories in magazines before they started coming out as books, but the first book form comes out in 1909 called The Clue, with this beautiful decorative binding. And it's going to be followed by 81 more. These are a couple of the early mysteries. And if you're noticing some big masculine energy in the dust jackets, it's no wonder. Women were not really dominating the genre yet. In fact, they were sometimes unwelcome. There's a quote from a Los Angeles critic that I love from this time period, 1916. He writes, "Detective stories written by women do not, as a rule, promise much in the way of entertainment. They set at defiance every known law of reason and play havoc with the reader's credibility. But Carolyn Wells is different." Which I love that he turned it around, but can really hear the misogyny all the same. Another thing she's doing at this time, like yet another thing she's doing, is working on silent films. She worked on at least 16 films between 1908 and 1927. And so this is really just skimming the surface. 4 out of the films that are pictured here are actually adaptations of her mystery novels. The one on the bottom right, the one with the green background, Deary, is the only original here. And what Carolyn was working on was writing what they called the scenarios or stories, a sort of really basic plot line for the films. She did most of her work with Thomas Edison, but also she worked for the S&A Company, Biograph, Paramount. And in promoting these films, Carolyn was always highlighted. I mean, she's becoming at this point a household name. So if you can't see really on the Deary poster because it's so small here, but this one's from 1927. And her name actually appears larger than that of the director on this movie poster, which I think is pretty awesome. And here's yet another thing that Carolyn wrote. It's the first history and how-to of the genre of mysteries. So it's called The Technique of the Mystery Story. She basically did a kind of a survey, a review of the mystery genre at the time, looked at its historical roots, classified its various forms, and evaluated its finest examples. In doing so, she really codified what they called the rules of the game, which later critics would actually kind of use against her, by saying things like, well, you said not to use a secret panel, and like, here you are using a secret panel, of course. But she also really put forth these philosophies she had about mysteries. And one of them was this, that, they were meant to entertain and to amuse and to interest. There was nothing deeper about them. At least that was her opinion. And she also felt that a good mystery was like a good poem or a good puzzle, mechanical, almost like a math equation. So, it was exactly what she felt the mystery genre was, but the genre actually starts evolving after that, after the first 10, 15 years of this like how done it, or this clue puzzler being the dominant version of a mystery. The genre starts evolving. Carolyn doesn't quite evolve with it, which is one of the problems, but we'll get to that. Here are some of her sort of middle period mysteries. Let's say like 1918 to the mid 1920s. The one here, Vicky Van, that one's from 1918. It was one of her bestsellers. It actually was published on the pages of Argosy magazine, and then it became a best-selling novel, and then it actually became a film. And it's still by some scholars considered really one of her best, a kind of quintessential example of the genre at the time. Even the august English critic and detective novelist G.K. Chesterton, who was a contemporary of hers and a friend of hers, complimented this book several times in the London Illustrated News. But I have this slide here really just so you can see some of the beautiful book jacket art that her mysteries had. This really like lush Art Deco designs. So here we have a building. This is a New York City apartment building called the Hotel des Artistes. In 1918, Carolyn surprised everyone, and maybe herself too, by getting married. She was 55 at the time, and he was slightly older. And she moves out of her family house. I mean, she had been living in her mother's home in New Jersey all this time. She marries a man named Hadwin Houghton. Despite that very famous Houghton name, everyone wants to equate him with the publishing house, and indeed he was related to the publishing house Houghtons, but he did not work in publishing. He actually worked in the paint and varnish industry, which I think is an important point, because I wonder sometimes if people try to make that publishing connection as if to say, well, that's how she got published so much, but it's untrue. But in any case, they get married, they move to New York City, they move to this beautiful building on 1 West 67th Street. It's a luxury apartment building, which is known for housing writers and artists. So she really fits right in. And unfortunately, Hadwin only lives about 18 months after their marriage. So between, she probably has a decision to make at that point. Do I stay here in New York City? Do I go back to Rahway, New Jersey? She decides to stay. And she becomes very involved in social clubs and bookish groups like the Authors League, the Colony Club, the Dickensian Club, the 12th Night Club. And she was really busy establishing herself as, they called her the Dean of American detective novels. In that role, they asked her this question, why women read detective stories, published in this magazine in 1930, which Carolyn, being Carolyn, didn't quite answer. She kind of just is like, why not? And then jokes around a little bit. I have this slide here mainly because I love that this is a question they asked her to address. Like there was still that, and this is 1930, so there's still that lingering misogyny in the genre. Here are some of the covers of her later mysteries, like 1930s. Yeah, I think these are all 1930s. You can see there in the middle, Murder in the Bookshop, which I mentioned earlier in my talk. This is probably my favorite Carolyn Wells mystery, and it was her biggest bestseller. It was a New York Times bestseller in 1936. It involves the theft of a rare book, and The Murder of a Book Collector by Skewering, which is pretty interesting. I won't tell you anymore. And I guess if you're going to start with one of her novels, I would probably go with Murder in the Bookshop if you're really into this, like, you like bookish mysteries. Maybe I'd go back to Vicky Van, that one I mentioned before. But the others listed here, I guess mainly I'm just looking at their book jacket art, but I do want to mention about the Tapestry Room Murder, because that's an interesting one because it's dedicated to President Hoover. She was acquainted with several presidents, Hoover included. And the dedication is, "My longtime friend who lives up to the presidential tradition of liking detective stories." Now, as I mentioned before, for Carolyn, the puzzle was the heart of the mystery. And even when that type of detective novel fell out of critical favor, she persisted. Perhaps it's because it's what she enjoyed herself, but it also could be because that's what her readers expected, and they adored her, no matter what some later critics started to say. She claimed not to care about reviews because, in her words, the books, quote, "sell like hotcakes anyhow." And she was right. As detective fiction scholar Curtis Evans put it, she was critically bulletproof. Even in the late 1930s and 40s, there was one review outlet called Kirkus, which some of you may know, actually started to review her later novels with these honey phrases like, "guess Wells gone dry," and "all's well that ends wells," just absolutely brutal. But it is worth pointing out that, over 32, over 82 titles, there were well-reviewed novels, there were poorly reviewed novels, and then there was just a lot in between. In fact, having read through hundreds, if not thousands, of reviews of all of those novels, I would, most tilted toward positive. So, which to me is a really important point when you're considering whether Carolyn was, quote, "a good writer" or "a bad writer," which is a question I get a lot. I'm not interested in what maybe I think or even what most people today think. I'm interested in what her contemporaries thought. And related to this is another thing from the Ohio State University Library's collection, because you all have several of her original annotated typescripts for these later mysteries. I believe there are 8 of them, but maybe Jolie can answer that a little bit later. But here are 2. My personal favorite, again, Murder in the Bookshop, and then The Visiting Villain, published in 1934. And these transcripts, because they have some dedications on them, it helps me determine how they ended up in Ohio. Carolyn has signed and inscribed them to her maid, Bridget Mary O'Connell. And that's something to keep in mind for the next few slides. This is just a slide that, because I feel it's really impressive to see all at once. These are just her Fleming Stone mysteries. There were 61 of those, 82 total mysteries, but 61 Fleming Stones. She wrote, when she was writing only mysteries, the last, say, 20 years of her life, she was writing 3, 4, sometimes 5 per year. Readers loved her, especially in the 20s and 30s. She's selling an average of 13,000 copies each, which would be great today. Then it's almost unbelievable. It really put her amongst the top tier sellers. Mary Roberts Reinhardt was kind of her nearest competition in this, and and Reinhardt always outsold Carolyn, but still, 13,000 copies average is amazing. But even more importantly, public libraries loved her. A survey of most read fiction in the Chicago area public libraries from 1936 put her behind Zane Grey, who was #1, the very famous Western writer, but well ahead of Agatha Christie, and absolutely crushing Virginia Woolf. Carolyn also wrote an autobiography, which you would think would be hugely helpful when you're then going to write a biography about her. But the thing about it is, it's really well written, but it's quite unusually written. It's very breezy. It's nonlinear. It's almost like a stream of consciousness kind of story, as if she weren't taking any of it very seriously, which is actually a theme in her career, a projection that she likes to put out there. but there's not a lot of dates. There's not a lot of, certainly not a lot of personal information. The only kind of names you read about in this book are kind of names you want to drop, not really names of like your family members. So you don't get a whole lot of that kind of information data out of it. You get wonderful stories about her life. And this you can also see here an ad in Publishers Weekly for the book, which I love because over 1 million readers have been primed for this book. I mean, again, speaking to the fact that she had this tremendous readership. And this is also a review by the New York Times here. Carolyn Wells hates autobiographies, but they too liked it. They called it original and enjoyable. Yeah. And this is a point at which maybe we can consider her legacy. After her death, there was some mismanagement of her estate. Aside from a few specific bequests, she left everything to her maid, and didn't appoint a literary executor who would have been able to advocate for her, her rights, her copyrights, keeping her books in print, that kind of thing. Particularly in the case of paperback editions, which, if you know anything about the history of publishing, you know that paperbacks really exploded in America during World War II. She dies in 1942, and this is right when the paperback boom is really starting. And I do think her books would have been excellent in that vehicle. But unfortunately, again, there's no literary executive, there's nobody to go to those publishers and say, well, why don't we have, a paperback edition of this book or that book? So nothing happens after she dies. It's just completely cut off. Also, her archive is not saved from auction. It's sold off in pieces. So there's not a lot of torch bearing that goes on. Her books disappear from shelves and her name is slowly erased. It reminds me that, Stephen King wrote this thing in the Washington Post a few months ago where he suggested that popular authors just don't get remembered, especially when it comes to genre fiction. It could be too that maybe we only have enough capacity to remember the name of, one great female detective novelist of the early 20th century, and like Agatha Christie already fills that slot. There's no getting around that. She happens to have a very energetic estate. But anyway, to talk about another facet of Carolyn's legacy, Carolyn had always been a collector. In fact, she collected autographs from all of her famous friends for decades. And not just autographs, but pieces of art on paper, inscriptions, poems, and had them bound in this amazing autograph album, which she called At the Sign of the Mermaid. It's a stunning volume bound in gilt red Morocco, and it remains in the hands of her great niece, who graciously allowed me to visit it and her while writing my book. And here are some of the examples along the bottom. I don't know how much how large this is on your screen, how much you're seeing, but you do have there, let's see, the hand-drawn title page At the Sign of the Mermaid. And then in the center, you have an original Charles Dana Gibson illustration. And then you have a few lines written and signed by Theodore Roosevelt from the White House in 1903. And those are just, just a few examples. I mean, it's a voluminous album. And she collected in other scrapbooks as well. This is not the only scrapbook, although it is definitely the biggest and best. It wasn't until the death of Hadwin, her husband, that she really turned her attention to collecting rare books. She needed a distraction. So 3 friends, one of whom was Belle DeCosta Green of the Morgan Library, and A. Edward Newton, who was a pretty famous bibliophile and author of books about book collecting, and her really good closest friend, Harriet Sprague. Between the 3 of them, they really kind of pushed her in the right directions for, how to begin collecting books. Newton and Sprague actually pushed her toward collecting Walt Whitman. And she chose for her bookseller, Alfred Goldsmith, with whom she shared an affinity for Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear. His New York City bookshop at the Sign of the Sparrow was actually used as the scene of the crime in her book, Murder in the Bookshop. Together, they co-wrote this Whitman bibliography. She'd only been collecting for a few years, but she had collected so voraciously they were able to put together this bibliography in just a few years. And it actually became the standard bibliography for like 50 years. So Carolyn wasn't the type of collector to, the way she got all these books is she was not the type of collector to just sit around and wait for quotes from booksellers or wait for an auction to happen. She put her pen to work and wrote to booksellers far and wide, asking, what do you have in Whitman? This earned her at least one big enemy in book collecting. That was a man named Vincent Starrett, who found her methods vulgar and quipped that she didn't understand the great gulfs that lie between the collecting of hat pins and the collecting of books. He also wrote detective novels, so they might have been competing in more than one place. But in 3 years, she had amassed so many rare Whitman volumes. It was considered one of the best collections, if not the best collection in the world. And she had to actually hold an auction of just her duplicates. So you can see here the October 18th, 1923 auction that happens. It's just Whitman duplicates. She had four different auctions over her lifetime, 3 of which were for books, and 1 of which was for, after her death, the other material that wasn't books, furs, furniture, jewelry, that kind of thing. But so you have the 1923 auction of books. You have again in 1936 some selections from her library. She starts kind of weeding out. She had a bit of a health scare in the early 1930s, and she started thinking about what was going to happen to her collections after she died. So 1936, she starts weeding some material out. And then 1942, this is after her death, there's an auction of, just the books alone. And this is where most of her archive gets broken up as well. But what does not get sold off is the Walt Whitman collection, this kind of core collection of 100 editions of Leaves of Grass and a little bit more. That all went to the Library of Congress. And I was actually able to visit there in January of 2023, shortly before this book was due to the publisher. And I basically just went to kind of commune with the volumes there. One of the things I'm still kicking myself for not requesting to see is the copy of Leaves of Grass that Walt Whitman had inscribed to Henry David Thoreau when they met each other. Considering it was a copy of Walden that kind of set my whole project into orbit, it really would have been a perfect full circle moment, but I'll have to go back. So that collection remains there at the Library of Congress. And the other thing that did not get sold off was the material, as I would come to learn, that Carolyn's maid, Mary O'Connell, she retained this small collection for herself. It included those typescripts that Carolyn had inscribed to her, and a handful of more personal items. The booklet Carolyn made, that little tiny boarding school booklet when she was 6, the handmade ABC book that we saw before, and this, which is a photo album of a trip she took with some friends to the Jersey Shore in 1892. But I just love that photo. They're lying on a beach, but they're all dressed like head to toe plus hats. For whatever reason, these are really special pieces that were kept by O'Connell, perhaps as souvenirs of the 2 decades that she had worked as Carolyn's caretaker. And then they were handed down through her family. So this collection came to Ohio in 1985. Jolie was actually able to dig up a provenance file for the papers that listed the date, price, and bookseller. And the full saga is in my book, but all the signs eventually pointed toward O'Connell's daughter, who had died in late 1984. And this collection came to Ohio, through a bookseller right after that. So it's really rather direct. It goes from Carolyn to the O'Connell family and then to OSU, where it will be preserved for all future researchers, thankfully. And even though there's a lot to despair about what happened to Carolyn's archive, there's at least this, which I find really wonderful, hopeful, compelling. This is one last photo of Carolyn, very likely the last, taken in her apartment in 1937, when she was interviewed for a radio program. You can see her library there in the backdrop and some of her other collectibles in the foreground. She liked to collect silver and glass and all kinds of little knickknacks. To my knowledge, it's the only image of her in her apartment, with her books, with her library, which makes it really special. And then lastly, here's my book, which is the product of this 3-year or maybe 13-year quest, depending on how you count. And my hope is really just that it brings Carolyn back into the conversation. And that's my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing, right? I'm going to stop sharing here, I think, Julie? Yes. Okay. And then we'll do questions.
Yeah, Rebecca, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Good.
And I'm looking in the Q&A and it looks like several questions have already come in, so we have plenty to work with.
Oh, good.
So I think perhaps you answered this. The first question is there a connection between Carolyn Wells and OSU, and wanting information about how the papers came to us?
Yeah. I mean, there's no real connection except for the fact that in 1985, there's some really forward-thinking, librarian or curator at OSU bought these materials, and they've been preserving them and storing them ever since, until this point at which we could really make this connection between her and the papers.
Yeah, and I think my suspicion, I think I maybe mentioned to you, Rebecca, that a previous curator had a real interest in mysteries and mystery fiction. So I feel like it might be part of that. Some of you may know that we also house the Papers of Mysterious Press, the mystery publisher. So it kind of feels like it's a good fit in some way. All right, so another question is, was Carolyn able to support herself from her writing? When and how did her world start to open up because of her success?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think she actually had to support herself from her writing, at least, based on what I know about her family and family history. Although there is at least one place that I saw mention that maybe her father had lost some of their money, and maybe at that point she wanted to sort of rev up production to try to make up some of those losses, because they retained this big house in Rahway. She actually had lots of social clubs that she belonged to, and she loved fashion. She loved dressing well. She loved gowns from Paris. I mean, she had some tastes that required a lot of money to fuel, but certainly when she was writing mysteries, she was making a very good living from them.
Great, thank you. So let's see, next question starts by saying, Rebecca, thank you so much for your work. I'm excited to listen to my audiobook delivered today. What surprised you the most when conducting this research on Wells, and what are you working on next?
Gosh, what surprised me? Who knows? I feel like every time I found a new archive that had a packet of her stuff, even if it was a small packet, every time I found something like that, it was just a new moment of like, okay, great. What is it? What puzzle piece is this going to add into the greater picture? So, I mean, but then again, if I had to pick one thing, it would definitely be when I got an email from Phyllis, Carolyn's great niece, saying to me, the one thing that the family does retain after all this time is the Mermaid album, which is just a beautiful, astounding piece of art. And because I actually had a rare book collector friend say to me, people have been wondering where this album has been, because when Carolyn was alive, it was mentioned several times in interviews that she did. People knew that she was collecting and knew about this book, and then for it to kind of vanish, for decades, and have some scholars think, where did that thing ever go? So to have her great niece say to me, well, I have it, you can come visit it, was like, wow, that was an amazing thing.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I love this next question. Why Walt Whitman in particular? And can you say more about the Lincoln Imp?
I don't know that much about the Lincoln Imp. I know that it's at the Lincoln Cathedral in England. It's actually a little stone statue carving. I've been looking into it because I was saying to my husband, if I ever get there, I'm definitely going to go visit this little thing. And I think that they have actually a little spotlight. So when you go to visit it, you can like flip a switch and the spotlight will turn on it so you can see it well. So I'm definitely going to do that one day. What was the other part of the question? was
Why
about
Walt Whitman?
by Walt Whitman. Good question. I mean, she actually did not enjoy Walt Whitman. She, I mean, in terms of poetry, she was much more of a rhyming sort of poet, and she did not really enjoy the free verse um, of Walt Whitman. I think it really had to do with, like I said before, A.E. Newton and her friend Harriet Sprague. They both kind of encouraged her toward Walt Whitman. She wanted to do something American, which makes a lot of sense if you realizing what you realize about her personality, and poetry. And she was just kind of willing to let them tell her where to go with it. And I was actually really surprised when I heard that Harriet, who was really her closest friend, also collected Walt Whitman, because I thought, like, most book collectors are very, like, if I were to say I was collecting the same things my friend, it would be this weird competition between us, and like, but they didn't see it that way. They actually would go out, looking for books together, which then who do you know, like, who gets to buy that piece? But they would buy things for each other too, and they would write to each other about the items that they bought. Like one of the things that I bought while doing research on this book, I bought a bunch of like collectibles for myself, basically, is a letter that Carolyn wrote to Harriet in 1929, saying that she stopped into the Walden bookshop and she bought a copy of On the Concord of Merrimack by Thoreau, and for $300. So she's basically writing to, and Harriet also collects. It's like, wouldn't you be upset? Like, or wouldn't you be jealous? But no, they weren't.
That's very fascinating and strange. Wow. Okay, so another great question. I'm curious about her humorous and satiric poems. How did her contemporary humorists or those she satirized respond to her work?
I don't know if anybody responded to the work. I've never seen any response. Um, but yeah, no, she was considered just very funny. She was in like every major magazine, Life and Harper's and the Saturday Evening Post. She had some poems published in the New Yorker. Like, she was just literally everywhere. But Margaret Stetz, the professor, the scholar that I mentioned before, she has done several scholarly articles on Carolyn's humor writing. So that's probably where to go to look for a better answer to that question.
Great. So another question about Wells' personal life. How did she meet her future husband? And I'll kind of add on just, I'm curious if he was a reader of her work.
Yeah, there's actually kind of two origin stories to how she met Hadwin. Carolyn could be a very unreliable narrator. Like, like I was saying before, she didn't really like to speak about her personal life to anybody. It was so it's really a kind of a question mark. Some in some of the marriage, articles announcing her marriage, it would say like she had known Hadwin Houghton for years, they were old family friends, but I never saw any evidence of that. So it's like, really? Who? But then the sort of more romantic story is that she was a longtime puzzle editor for various magazines. She made crossword puzzles. That's kind of one of her biggest things, was doing crossword puzzles, but also all kinds of just, like, she would have eaten Wordle for breakfast. Like, she was just really big on puzzles. And that he would write in with answers to these puzzles, that he was just some random guy who would write in with answers to the puzzles, but did it so often that they started corresponding and struck up a friendship, and that's how they met. Which, I mean, everyone wants to believe that story versus oh, they were old family friends.
Are there any surviving letters or any evidence of that? No.
There's nothing between them, and the closest I've gotten to anything personal, and that even mentions Hadwin and anything personal, is at Williams College. They have a collection of Carolyn's letters with Harriet, and it's really the only place I've seen anything that mentions, like I said, anything private, anything personal. And really, at this point, it's really all about Hadwin's death, because they get married and then he's pretty much sick and dies very soon after.
Okay, so the next question, I'm going to answer this because I love this question. Is there any way students can come and see these materials, or do you have to be a researcher? What are the restrictions? I am very happy to tell you there are no restrictions. If you're an OSU student or just someone in Columbus, you can come in, and entered our website URL in the chat earlier, so you can use that to follow up and kind of contact me and explore, and I'll also put that in the chat for this particular person as well. Love that question. Okay, so next is this person says Yale's Beinecke Library has some of Wells' scrapbooks and has posted some charming photos or drawings of hers on its blog. Did Wells ever illustrate any of her children's work or other work?
I've seen those scrapbooks actually. The scrapbooks at Yale were actually one of the first things I ever found when I was really starting the search and finding some institutional collections here or there. And I actually thought, when I first saw it, I thought that was the mermaid. I was like, oh, here's the mermaid. Yale has it. So yeah, so then I went to visit those scrapbooks. But no, I don't know that she had any artistic ability whatsoever. She really leaned on a man named Oliver Herford. I'm guessing that's how you say his name. And Gillette Burgess, who would also do some kind of quick little drawings. He did poetry too, but drawings as well. Those are kind of the two that she would lean on, but she worked with just loads of very famous illustrators. Like every book has a different illustrator.
Well, I think that actually leads to another great question. Let's see. Her publishers clearly assigned some of the best artists to do her covers. I particularly liked Oliver Herford design on baubles. Is there any indication that she had input on the design of her books? And I should mention that someone, I don't know if you had a chance to see this, but someone in the chat noted that one of her books had a Margaret Armstrong cover. So I think this kind of kicked off that question.
Yeah. I don't know if she had any input. The publishing archives that I've been able to find have been like everything else, here and there. But she was really very close friends with Oliver, so I would not be surprised if they collaborated very closely on all of those decisions. In fact, I think he also designed one, if not both of those book plates that we saw at the beginning.
Great. Okay, another really interesting question. Given Carolyn's hearing was impaired in one ear, do you think that influenced her writing in any way?
I wonder. Yeah, I wonder about that. She kind of takes offense, not offense, but she kind of goes up against Thomas Edison will come out and say, because he had hearing loss as well. And he'll come out and say, well, it helped me be a better inventor because, I could just I could tune everybody out and I never had to listen to any of that. I could just focus on my work. But she didn't really feel that way about it. She wrote articles about her disability, and she actually would say things like, the thing that really bothered her most about it is that if she's at a dinner party and people are talking about something and she wants to add witty comments, she wants to like participate in the conversation, but she's missed something they said. So she really felt a little bit left out in that sense. But so maybe writing was a refuge from that, but she was I think, a very stoic character. So kind of took all of that with, it is what it is, and I just keep moving forward, which seems like how she worked against everything, especially with editors or, magazines that didn't want to publish her stuff. I mean, she would just say, oh, okay, fine. And you just move on to the next. So I don't know if the same thing applied to her hearing, but that's my guess.
Okay, we have more questions, but we are coming up on the hour, so I think we have to wrap up. But I could share these questions with you if you're interested, Rebecca, later, and maybe we can follow up.
Yeah.
Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you, Rebecca, so much for a fantastic talk. If you see in the chat, there are more programs coming up at the library. You can click on that link to kind of explore and see what future events you might want to come out and see. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.